A woman once asked a group of monks that she was visiting, "What is the difference between heaven and hell?" One of the monks replied, "Follow us, and we will take you to hell, and then to heaven, and then you will see." The monks first escorted her to the bowels of hell, and she was completely amazed and surprised by what she saw there. There were banquet tables piled high with sumptuous amounts of food and fruit, meats and vegetables from every corner of the world, and every kind of dessert imaginable. There were choices there to suit vegetarians and vegans and omnivores, and those on a low-carb diet, and the greatest gluten-free desserts. However, she heard all the people there groaning and moaning out of hunger, and she noticed that they were very thin and pale. What is happening, she thought. She looked more closely at the tables, and she could see that the people seated there had 3-foot-long utensils splinted to their arms. And while they could reach the platters of food, they were never able to feed themselves. Next, she was escorted to heaven. She was shocked. It looked exactly the same. Once again, banquet tables with sumptuous amounts of food, and once again, people sitting there with 3-foot-long utensils splinted to their arms. But it was a lively place. It had the energy of coffee hour at the Unitarian Universalist Church. People were chatting and laughing and looked very well fed. Now, what she saw was that the people in heaven were picking up morsels of food with those 3-foot-long utensils and feeding someone next to them or in front of them and all around. You see, it was the very same opportunity. And before her, she saw they had the very same obstacles as in hell. But everyone was feeding one another, and no one went hungry. When I think about the classic understanding of our shared Universalist heritage, that you and I, and ultimately all of us, are heaven-bound, I always think of that parable of the long spoons. Heaven and hell are a creation of our own making, and they are both created right here on earth through our actions and our inactions. Today, Unitarian Universalists hold differing beliefs about what happens after we die, but we are still deeply influenced by our Universalist forebears, who changed the theological scene dramatically by doing away with the notion that some were destined to a place called hell, while others were destined for salvation. Our vision of a people reaching heavenward is about how we lead our lives right here on earth. It is about seeing the opportunities for and the obstacles to justice in our world and using the tools that we have to create peaceful and healing possibilities right here in this room and at all times and in all places. It's about creation of the beloved community that posits a world where none are excluded from a radically inclusive spirit of love. Not because of race, not because of gender identity, not because of sexual orientation, differences of ability, or religious beliefs. Martin Luther King Jr. put it this way: the end is redemption. The end is reconciliation. The end is creation of the beloved community. And James Luther Adams, one of our more famous Unitarian theologians, said this: ours is a religion that professes the prophethood and the priesthood of all believers. You see, we cannot, as a people who claim that religion's role is to help institutionalize freedom, to spread a liberating love, stand idly by while people around the world and in our very own backyard suffer from hatred and hunger. We cannot, as a people who extol the inherent worth of every human being, only demonstrate our care and compassion for the segments of the population that look like us, act like us, have like us, or even vote like us. Every person of faith is needed to take up that mantle of leadership and service. We are all called to be ministers, whether we work in a congregation or not, and whether or not we are ordained. We are all ordained by life itself, by the possibilities held in this day. If the civil rights movement teaches us anything, it teaches us this. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. built a movement out of a keen and embodied sense of that prophethood and priesthood of all believers. And it is due to that man's courage and vision and compassion, and due to the work of so many other men and women and children, that a black man served as our president. But the dream was about so much more than that. It was never one man's or woman's to achieve. It was the vision of the beloved community that excluded not anybody. So back to that woman in the parable. I see in her a model for our calling. She is willing to say yes, to move towards trouble. When the monks offer to take her to hell, she says yes. She's willing to go there. And she brings the tools of curiosity and compassion, the tools of our Unitarian and Universalist heritage. And she is willing to take a risk and step out into unfamiliar, even hellish territory in the pursuit of greater understanding and greater wholeness. Over the decades, we have used different language to describe our calling. But when we say that we believe in deeds, not creeds, or in standing on the side of love, we are describing the spiritual practice we undertake to co-create the beloved community. We aspire to be people who muster the courage to move towards trouble or the most pressing issues of our time, with our minds and hearts open wide and ready to learn how to lean into the work of justice. Two connected stories that come from the time of my childhood and one from just before I was born have always been a great example to me of this. The congregation that I serve in Morristown, New Jersey, opened its doors to the Gay Activist Alliance of Morris County in 1972. A full 20 years before the welcoming congregation movement was sweeping Unitarian Universalist congregations. You see, the power of that year, 1972, was that the Morristown Unitarian Fellowship was in a very conservative part of New Jersey. And even gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender members of the congregation, and back then, really, bisexual and trans were not really talked about. Even gay and lesbian members were closeted, not just in the wider community, but in the congregation. But that group of Unitarian Universalists, when they were approached by a group of gay men that said they wanted to convene to talk about the issues that they were facing, and when they shared that every other house of worship and every other public space had denied them room, the leadership moved towards trouble and said, "We don't know yet what is the pathway of love, but what we do know is that the way will become clear out of relationship and connection and greater understanding." And so they opened their doors. And of course, today there is no us and them. We are two bodies interwoven in one congregation. And blissfully, although there is still much work to be done on the LGBT movement front. People are far from closeted. It is a whole and holier space. The congregation that I grew up in New York City in the 1980s also was engaged in a similar process of leaning into the pressing issues of our time, of saying yes to moving towards trouble and what we would learn from it. That was the time that the AIDS crisis had reached a feverish pitch, and actually homophobia was very much a part of that time. AIDS once had the name GRID. I don't know how many of you remember that. Gay-related immunodeficiency. And so people had closed off their hearts and minds to the plight of so many people in our pews and in our community. Well, this was an example of everyone claiming their ministry. Nurses and doctors and caretakers talked about and leaned into the work of caring for their patients and their beloveds. People suffering with AIDS shared their stories and broke silence. The artists helped us learn how to fashion quilts and gardens so that we could celebrate the beauty of the lives that we were losing at an alarming rate. And the advocates were out there marching in the streets and advocating for us to enact legislation where no one would be discounted. And All Souls had a campaign where we had ads taken out on city buses that said slogans like, AIDS is a human disease, it requires a humane response. And I loved how as a child in my city, in the midst of homophobia, in the midst of people's lives at stake, our values were on the move all over town. And over time, we shifted the attitude of the members of our wider city from callousness to compassion. This is our call in our own time to move towards trouble, to celebrate all the gifts that each one of us has to bring to light, to lean into the work of justice. And in the last couple of years, I have been invited to a number of opportunities where I've literally been asked to move my feet and my body in the direction of the pressing issues of our time, to move towards trouble. And I want to share from two instances. I responded to the call for interfaith leaders and people of faith across the country to show up at Standing Rock in North Dakota, because truly the quality of water and global climate justice, these are some of the biggest issues of our time. And so I showed up for that pilgrimage. And really, I think these marches that we're being invited to, the Women's March I know a number of you went to, are really spiritual practices asking us to think about not just that day, what it would look like to take steps towards a pathway of love, but to return with the fullness of the practice and to ask ourselves how to do that every day. So I showed up in Standing Rock, and one piece of trouble for me, again, moving towards trouble can be an opportunity for learning, was that women at this outdoor temple, this sacred ground of Standing Rock, were asked to wear skirts at all times. And as a feminist, that for me took some leaning into because of my cultural assumptions around that. But in the Dakota culture, skirts are what set women apart and are the dress to honor the sacred ground that you're walking on. And so the question for me was, as a white woman, would I follow the lead of my Native American sisters asking me to do this? And I said yes. And so each and every day, I'm not accustomed to wearing a skirt when it's 0 degrees outside. I wore a skirt with fleece pants underneath, and it did. It reminded me at every moment that I was not in my ordinary space. I was invited into a beautiful, sacred community and to partake of all the lessons there. And so I'm grateful that I said yes to something that was troubling at times. And there in that community, every morning it was such a prayerful place. We talk about protest, but really they used the language of protecting water. And every morning we began with a 2-hour blessing ceremony with Native Americans and indigenous tribes from around the world sharing their ceremonies to honor water. And then we would move down a row of flags that represented every nation around the globe and come to the river's edge and pour out our prayers in words, in spirit, and in the form of tobacco. And every morning we would form a human bridge at the edge of that water so that we could help someone lean into that icy water without falling in. And then we would rotate around and take our place in that human bridge. And I want you to know who was there. That was a time when there were thousands of military veterans at the same time there. So there were people of faith, there were military veterans, and there were peaceniks holding hands and buoying one another up. And we glimpsed a vision of the beloved community we are trying to create. But every time that we enter into these spiritual practices, brokenness is there too. Remember that heaven and hell are the same place. It is how we act that shapes the difference. A second glimpse is from traveling with the We Belong Together movement, a movement of immigrant rights activists from around the country, many of whom are undocumented women. And I joined them on 2 pilgrimages, one from a 100-mile pilgrimage from York, Pennsylvania, at a detention center to Washington, D.C., and one on a border pilgrimage from El Paso to Juarez and back. As I moved towards trouble on that second journey, again, my eyes were open to some of the work that remains to be done. When we crossed the border to go into Mexico, literally you could just walk across as if you were moving from one town to another in the suburbs around the country. But on the journey back, it was very different. And sadly, a number of people of color, none of the white folks that were there, were taken aside. And one woman was taken back and detained by ICE, who joked about how her name was the same as someone who had committed crimes, and all the while laughing, telling her she would go to prison that day. And I became conscious of something I knew, and I brought that curiosity, that spirit that Unitarians often bring, and I questioned the guards. And standing side by side with immigrant rights activists, immigrants, we did not move until she was returned to the group. Now that I expected. But when we moved towards what was theological trouble for me later in the day, something happened that I didn't quite expect, a learning experience. I was invited to join the many Catholics that were part of the group to go to the Catholic Church for a mass for immigrants. And I thought, wow, we don't have anything like that in the Unitarian Universalist movement. Let me go and learn. And it was a beautiful ceremony outdoors in the courtyard of a church. And then I learned we were going to go into the church for 2 hours more of Mass. And I had had enough theological trouble. So I hung back a little bit. And I noticed, and I think this is important, even in heaven, even in these places of spiritual wholeness, to notice where there is brokenness and who is not at that banquet table. There were 6 young adults, 6 immigrants who were standing by the fountain, and so I joined them and I asked, I'm curious, why aren't you joining the rest of the service? And they said, because we don't feel welcome in that building, and in fact, parts of us are not being welcome on this march at all. That group of 6 immigrants identified all of them as LGBT individuals, and they longed for every part of themselves to be welcome at that march. And it turned out that on the 100-mile pilgrimage, one of the women, a trans woman who was on the journey from male to female, had shown up in her hotel room, and another woman, immigrant, shut the door in her face. And so she spent the whole night sleeping in her car outside, and spent the journey exhausted because her roommate wouldn't even let her in. And so they shared this story, and we talked about how might we work together to bring this to the attention of the leadership so that the fullness of all the immigrants on the march would be able to be welcome there. And that planted